Hey, Marie Gervais here from Shift Management, and I wanted to do a post today to explain why it is difficult for newcomers to Canada to keep their first job. So I'm going to talk to you about that because it is something that happens a lot. It's first hard to find a job. Then when you find a job, it can be really hard to get past the first 3-month probation period. And there are some specific reasons for that you can actually work to avoid. So I wanted to give you the heads up on what that could be so that you can find out how to do things differently. So I'm going to start out with a typical workplace story. So what we have is what happens is people often get into big cultural misunderstandings, and that's what I wanted to address here. And I'm going to give you a story, and the story is about a newcomer who found a job by working with an employment counselor at an immigrant serving organization, which I recommend because employment counselors have direct connections with employers, and they can recommend people that they think would be good for the job. So this newcomer was using the services that were offered, which were to go to an employment counselor at an immigrant serving organization. And they found a diversity-friendly employer who was very excited to hire him. And he worked as a quality assurance manager, which was his background. So he was really glad to get the job. It paid well, and he was happy working there. So it would have been a success story, except that what happened was, at the 3-month probation period, which is usually when employers decide if they're going to keep you or not, there is often a meeting with your manager. And so this newcomer employee's manager called him into his office and said it was time for his 3-month probation meeting. And the employee had no clue what that meeting was about. He didn't realize that after he was hired that there was a testing period, even though it might have been explained to him in the beginning. The thing is, when you're new to a job and new to the country and everything feels very strange to you, it's pretty easy to miss out on stuff. So, by the way, if you are listening to this, make sure that you share the video and let other people know about it, and feel free to comment and post. I'm really excited to respond to people's questions, and we can also show the comments directly on the screen if you decide you would like to do that. So feel free to comment, to post, and also to push some likes and some loves if this is something that is you are interested in learning more about. So as I was saying, this newcomer was in a good position. He got the job, and the job was working for him. But what he was surprised at was that he was called into his manager's office for a 3-month probation meeting. And then his manager proceeded in the typical Canadian feedback way, which usually is not understandable to newcomers, and told him some positive things, and then told him a couple of things he wanted him to correct. And then he told him some negative things. Well, the newcomer was very upset, and he thought, well, this manager is now going to tell the whole company that I'm incompetent and I've just lost face in front of everybody. And he was really worried about it, and he jumped up and he said, you can't treat me that way. And he was sure he was going to be fired, and so he just left. He just said, I quit, and he left and walked out in the middle of the day, in the middle of the workday, and in the middle of the meeting with his manager. And he went straight to his employment counselor, and the employment counselor tried to figure out what happened, and then called back the manager and said, this is what happened. And the manager said, okay, well, he can come back as long as he apologizes for walking out on me in the middle of the meeting and in the middle of a workday. And when the newcomer heard about that, he said, now he really does want to humiliate me, and there's no way I'm going back to work there. So you can see how this is a problem. There were a lot of things that went wrong with that particular situation, and they're actually all avoidable. So I'm going to go to the next piece. So what went wrong with that particular situation is 3 different reasons. One is that communication problems, and so I'm trying to click on the title here, and it's not clicking. Come on, agenda. Okay. So the first reason was because of Canadian workplace communication expectations that the employee was not used to, and also the employer wasn't used to. So the newcomer employee was not clear on what the communication protocols were. And this is something that happens quite frequently. In fact, people are afraid to ask questions and to clarify what they don't understand because they think they're going to look bad. They think they're going to lose face and they'll look bad. So they don't clarify what the communication needs to be. And each company has its own communication rules and things they like. But generally speaking, in Canada, people want to hear back from you throughout a project. So if you've been assigned a task, they want you to come back and say, okay, I've been working on it. I've gotten this far. Is that okay? Am I on the right track? And then afterwards, come back and do it again. And then afterwards, you're ready to go. So those things are things that people tend to look for. And if you are worried that you might not sound good or you might be missing something, you may not ask those questions. You may just assume everything's going to be okay as long as you keep quiet. When in fact, that is probably the worst thing you can do. If you just assume things are going to be okay and keep quiet and don't share your work, that's going against a typical Canadian workplace communication rule. And so you want to make sure that you're asking questions that say, if you were starting this project, this is what you can do about it. So if you were starting this project, what would you do to get going? So I'm going to show you what would you do to get going. And ask another question would be, if you were me, how would you get started? How frequently do you want to hear about the project progress? And when do managers communicate to their employees, and what are employees expected to do? So you're going to ask a question that allows you to ask without losing face. If you were me, what would you do in this situation? How would you normally handle it? How do you expect me to communicate with you? And those kinds of questions are going to get you to the next step, which is really good, because if you don't, the employer is going to say, oh, there's a problem and everybody needs to be babysat, or they bug me with too many questions, or they don't ask anything and take no initiative. And those are common complaints. So now here's another reason why you might have problems. And the reason you might have some issues, and this particular employee story went that way, the reason he had some issues was because of feedback. So feedback is different in every single culture, and there are 3 types of feedback. One is positive, one is corrective, and one is negative. And so if you're giving positive feedback in some cultures, that's considered a problem. Many cultures don't give positive feedback. If things are going fine, they're just going fine and they don't say anything about it. But here people expect positive feedback. And that means that you give compliments, you acknowledge their work, you tell them they're doing a good job. And so the positive feedback is really necessary. And if you're not used to doing that, that's going to be a problem for you. So you're going to have to look to see how other people do it and start copying a little bit of positive feedback so that you look like you are friendly. A lot of people lose their job in the 3-month probation period because they don't offer any positive feedback, and their employers think that they are unfriendly and they're not a good fit. So positive feedback is the first kind of feedback issue. The other kind of feedback issue is that you might have, you might want to know how to correct somebody who's made a mistake, or somebody may correct you. And if you are being corrected, that's very specific to the culture in the country, and it's not the same. Every country is different, and in Canada, it's also typical that people will correct you. So it could be they'll correct you if they're your manager, but if they're your colleague or your friend, they won't be correcting you. So unless they've been assigned to you as a buddy, in which case they might correct you, and you should also not correct them. If you do correct them, then that could be a problem for you. So generally speaking, people who are lower than the manager would not correct the manager. But in some cultures, they do. They give the correction to the manager. So in Canada, you don't do that. And there's another kind of feedback, which is a negative feedback. So saying that there's a criticism or that you have a negative opinion about something. And I would just say don't give that at all. So if you're new to the country and you're new in the job, don't give a negative opinion about something, because it's generally not going to go well for you. If you receive a negative feedback, then don't take it personally. Say, this is something that has to do with my job, and this is typical of what people are doing here to try and keep people on track for their jobs. So make sure that your feedback, that when you receive it, that you don't take it as a personal insult. That you have to find out how people are expected to respond when they get negative feedback. So here again, you can use your indirect question. So you can say, when people get feedback here, what's the appropriate way to respond? How do people expect you to respond when you get negative feedback? In my country, or where I'm from, or back home, people, if they were managers, they would give feedback in this way. Is that what people do here? Or you could say, I'm not used to giving positive feedback, or I'm not used to giving negative feedback or corrective feedback, because in my country we don't do that. So what do you expect here, and how do people respond? You want to know how people respond, because you want to make sure that you're making the correct response, the expected response. So when people don't do that, that's often when they lose the job. They give the wrong expected response, and people's feelings get hurt, and then they say, oh, this person's not a good fit, I don't think we can keep them. So that's the other reason. And there's one other one, I'm just going to check my notes here. And the other one, oh yes, formalities. Okay, so it can also be a difference in formality. So in a formal culture, the person who's the employee would probably not address their manager. They wouldn't speak to them. They wouldn't offer an opinion. If they were asked, they would never offer anything that would be negative to their manager. So, and there would be a distance between the manager and the employee. So they have this distance between them. In an informal culture, people are more peer. And so they don't use titles. People can speak to each other across hierarchy. And it's possible for people to communicate. They don't usually call somebody Mr. or Dr. or Chief Engineer. They call them by their first name. And they have a little bit more of a relaxed way of communicating. But in a formal culture, when people act informally like that, they think it's disrespectful. And in an informal culture, if people act too formal, then they think that they're being arrogant and snobby and looking down at them. So you can see how that would cause a problem. And so you would want then to find out what how formal or informal the culture is in the company where you're working. And really the only way you can find that out is by watching. So you have to watch the interactions between employees and managers and see, is this formal or is this informal? How informal is this? How formal is that? Who is speaking more formally to whom? And you have to figure it out. And after you've been watching, you might like to check with a colleague and say, I think that when managers speak to employees and employees speak to managers, they do it this way. Did I get that correct? Because it's not easy to pick up the cultural cues across cultures, because you didn't grow up with them. So it's easy to miss them. So I forgot to put up that third reason, so I'm going to put that third reason up there. So the third reason was difference in formality. So those are the three reasons that the employee in the story that I just told you, the reason that he didn't keep the job. Now, in that case, the manager was perfectly willing to keep him there, but the employee was so worried that he had lost face in front of the company, that he made a mistake that was irreparable, and he misunderstood the cultural workplace expectations with regard to communication, feedback, and hierarchy. And so he just thought, well, there's no point in even trying to stay because I've just lost the job, when in fact, he didn't lose the job. And then the other piece was that he just felt that now everything had gone so wrong that there was no way he could go back to the manager and say, oh, I'm sorry, because that would have been inappropriate in his culture to do something like that. So those three things can really stop people from keeping the job once they've got it. And they're all related to knowing how to respond in a new cultural context and how to ask the kinds of questions that will get you answers so that you don't lose the job, so you keep the job. So now I'm going to also suggest to you that you consider coming to our Canadian Workplace Certificate course. We have an online certificate course that teaches you the cultural differences and how to gauge the differences between cultures and find out where you are and where the company is that you're working for. How is that working? So if you take the course will give you all of the online content that you need, with a lot of self-assessments and examples, so you can compare where you're coming from and to the company that you're working for in the job that you're in. And it's also going to help you to figure out what responses might work better in a variety of contexts. So it's really useful. And there are 3 parts to it. One part is learning to think like an employer. The other one is finding and keeping work in Canada. And the third part is how to deal with things once you have a job. So it's extremely useful, and I recommend you take a look. I'll also put the link on the bottom of this post so you can consider it. And if it seems like it's a good fit for you, well, take the course. It's not expensive, and you will be able to use it all the time. You get lifetime access to it. There's also live coaching, group coaching that you set up according to your schedule. So it's all ways that you can understand the Canadian workplace culture so that when you find a job, you can keep it. So that's all I wanted to talk to you about today. And I'm looking forward to seeing some comments on the video later. And thank you so much for tuning in and for sharing the video. And if you haven't liked the page, Canadian Workplace page, please do. Liking the page is really helping us to move everything forward. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.